I think these are just defilements seen from different perspectives. And the word kilesa is barely found in the sutras at all. I think it's found maybe once in the Anguttara Nikaya 3s or something like that. And the standard word in the sutras for kilesa is upakilesa. That's kind of the usual word. And if you, in a number of places, the word upakilesa is obviously found in the Upakilesa Sutta. And if you read that sutta, you will see it basically refers to refined defilements of the mind, the very last hindrances that you have to abandon before you enter the jhana states. That's really what it is there. In other places, the 5 hindrances are called upakilesa. So the 5 hindrances are a very similar kind of thing. It's actually interesting to really consider what the 5 hindrances are. And, when you look at the gradual training, and by the gradual training, I mean the sort of training that you see in the Chulahati Padopama Sutta, the shorter discourse on the elephant's footprint, Majjhima 27, and you see the whole sequence of gradual training starting from the moment you hear the word of the Buddha until you become an arahant. And what you see there and what you see throughout the sutras is that the 5 hindrances is what you abandon just before you enter samadhi, just before you enter the jhanas. And prior to that, there is a long purification process prior to that. That is the purification process where you restrain the senses. So Indriya Sangvara Sila. And then you have, even before that, of course, you have ordinary morality, the restraint in speech and actions. You have the contentment, you have the Indriya Sangvara Sila, and then you have the Sati Sampajanya paragraph, which is also about restraining and by keeping a pure mind. And only then, at the end of all of that, actually sometimes then you have Bhojana Matanyuta, the knowing moderation in eating and wakefulness sometimes we have in there as well. And only then do you have abandoning the 5 hindrances. So the way the 5 hindrances are described in the sutras, they seem to be very refined things. That the very last thing that you abandon before you enter jhana. That's why they're called upakilesa. That's why they match with the upakilesas of the Upakilesa Sutta. So I think we often use the idea of 5 hindrances wrong in Buddhism. We say that any kind of ill will, any kind of desire is a hindrance, is a nivarana. But actually, I don't think that is true. I think a lot of the coarser hindrances there might be nivaranas in the broader sense, but they're not nivarana in the restricted sense you often find it in the sutras, where they mean a very refined problem that you have to abandon before the jhanas. So this is kind of the meaning of upakilesa. You also find the word upakilesa in the Vatupama Sutta, the simile of the cloth, Majjhima Nikaya number 7, where there it is a kind of a broad range of kilesas or defilements that you have, again, that hinder you from having metta. In that sutta, they're talking about the Brahma Viharas. So that is basically how I understand the upakilesas, the refined defilements of the mind, the defilements that you are investigating during satipatthana practice. The last satipatthana dhammanupassana, where you're reflecting on the nivaranas, the 5 hindrances, and you're trying to understand their causality, how they come into existence, what supports them, how you abandon them, what they are, how they stay abandoned. This is the standard kind of what you find in the Satipatthana Sutta. So that is kind of the main idea of upakilesa, or you can say kilesa. Kilesa is the standard word used often in Asia. You find it used in Thailand. And what is interesting about that it is used so many places in Asia, like in Thailand, it shows you the very great reliance on the commentaries in many of these countries. Very often when we discourse about the suttas, we discourse about the word of the Buddha, everything almost, we see it through the lens of the commentaries. So you go to Thailand and you speak to monks there about, what the Buddha taught. They will use words like kilesa, not upakilesa. They will use appana samadhi rather than jhana. They will use upachara samadhi very often. And they will use a whole host of terms that actually come from the commentaries rather than actually from the sutta. So we are, in many ways, we are hostage to the commentaries, and we are not really free of those commentaries. And you have to make an active effort sometimes to see where the commentarial influence, where the Abhidhamma influence actually affects our reading of the suttas. And in many ways, we are very lucky because most of us who are here today, we have grown up outside of a Buddhist country, which means that we come to these things with this hopefully slightly less conditioned minds because of that. So we have the ability to see these things afresh. But I think this is a very important thing to recognize. So when you read the suttas, be very careful of that inherent bias that we almost always have in understanding the suttas through the lens of the commentaries, through the lens of the Visuddhimagga, through the lens of the Abhidhamma, through the lens of all of these later texts, Jataka stories even, whatever it might be, and becomes very problematic. Then you have the āSAVAs that you mentioned. This is one of the other categories here of defilements. And the āSAVAs really is I think looking at the defilements from the most core aspect of what the defilements are. And it relates very much to the idea of craving. If you look at the kind of standard exposition of craving in the second noble truth, you have the idea of craving is the craving for sensual pleasures, the craving for existence, bhavatanha, and the vibhavatanha, the craving for extermination. And if you look at the āSAVAs, they are very similar to that. It's because you have the kāma-āSAVA, you have the bhava-āSAVA, and then you have the avijja-āSAVA. And the avijja-āSAVA might just be, you could maybe argue that it's similar to vibhavatanha, maybe, or you could argue that the avijja-āSAVA is really just a way of making sure everything is kind of accounted for. So in those two āSAVAs, the two main ones are obviously the kāma-āSAVA, and the bhava-āSAVA. So what this shows you, it shows you the main areas where we are stuck in samsaric existence. Very often, karma is the problem. Sensual, the attachment to the sensory world. And this is very, very broad. I mean, we wake up in the morning, we're part of the sensory world. You go to bed at night, you're part of the sensory world. Everything in between is part of that sensory world. You dream at night, you dream about the sensory world. Everything. We are so incredibly stuck in that sensory world. Almost our entire lives are about that sensory world. So the attachments, the desires, almost everything we have is part of that. So to be able to remove yourself from that sensory world is actually a very, very big thing. I mean, it's like you are removing yourself of what your entire life pretty much is about, unless you have some degree of access to samadhi or something like that. So the kāma-āSAVA is an incredibly sticky realm. And I think that is why it is mentioned separately as an āSAVA, because it shows you the core things that make us stick to samsaric existence. And then once you overcome the kāma-āSAVA, you kind of pull yourself out of this extraordinarily sticky realm. Then, of course, that is where the bhava-āSAVA starts to kick in. The bhava-āSAVA being the āSAVA of existence, however you want to translate that word. And so that is the second part. And of course, that has all to do with identity and who we take ourselves to be and all of these kind of things. That is another very important part of what it means to be human, and giving up our sense of identity completely, utterly, once and for all. Well, that is the kind of the problem of the last part of the path, beyond actually giving up sensory, the attachment to the sensory realm. Of course, you start to give up your identity long before that, and by giving up the sensory realm, you're also giving up large parts of your identity, because your identity is also intertwined with the sensory realm. We own things in that realm, we attach to things in that realm, obviously, so that also relates to our identity. But once you go beyond that realm, that's where you are really left with identity. So I think the āSAVAs are a focus on the two main sticking points in samsara. So it's an understanding of whether you actually have overcome samsaric existence or not. So whereas the upakilesas are much more practical, they are about what we need to look out for, the problems that block us from moving forward on the path, forward in meditation. The āSAVAs are more showing you the big picture of the problem, of what holds us, binds us to samsaric existence. And then you have to overcome those as a consequence. Then you have the ANUSAYAs, and the ANUSAYAs are really an understanding that many of these defilements, sometimes we think the defilement isn't present in the mind, but actually they are still there, just under the surface, waiting to come out. And I think the idea there is just to kind of show a number of areas in which there tends to be underlying tendencies. So karma is an obvious one. So the anusaya, is that what it's called? Anusaya? I can't remember now. Anyway, it says that the attachment to karma, even though you don't have any sensory desire, well, it will come back again. And this is true with so many of these anusayas. Even though you haven't got any ill will, it will return. I can't remember now what the 7 anusayas are off the top of my head, but it doesn't matter. The idea is that they are underlying there. And one of the very interesting anusayas, which I think is very important to point out, is called the asmimana anusaya. Asmimana is the conceit, I am. Asmi, I am. Mana is the conceit or the pride or the arrogance or whatever you want to call it of I am. It doesn't sound like very much arrogance, but that's what it is there, I am. And so it's the underlying tendency, I am. And one of the things that is very deceptive on the path of Buddhism is when you attain a deep jhana state, some very profound samadhi state. In that state, there is no sense of I am. And you will find very commonly in the Buddhist world, you will find people saying, well, I was in this jhana state, or I was in this deep state. There was no I am. And because there is no I am, there is no self there. I've gone beyond the idea of a self because the I am is not present in that state. But that is where you go wrong. This is such an important and fundamental thing to understand, because if you get this wrong, you get the entire idea what non-self actually is in Buddhism. You get that whole thing wrong. There's a misunderstanding. It is not about whether there is an I am in that state. That state may feel completely selfless in many, many different ways. But the question is, when you emerge from that state later on, do you then take that state to be me? Do you refer back to that as me? And that is what the asmimana anusaya is, the underlying tendency to the conceit I am. It may be gone for a while, but then when you come out of the state of the jhana, or whatever it is, you take it to be you. That was the real me. That's what I want to identify with. That is what it is. And once you get that, you understand that this very strong tendency in the human mind, this is very strong, of course, in many of the theistic traditions, partly in Advaita Vedanta and this, the Hindu, the kind of the part of the greater Hindu family of philosophical and spiritual practice ideas. Very, very common there, but also very common in Buddhism. I mean, you hear people saying the mind lasts forever. You're in a state where there is no I anymore. And when I hear someone say that the mind lasts forever, you know that they have lost the plot. You know that this is not Buddhism. You know that they have somewhere along the line, they have grasped onto something which is far more similar to Advaita Vedanta, far more similar to theistic ideas of the self than it is to what the Buddha taught. In Buddhism, you go to the Brahmajala Sutta, and you have the large series of wrong views in the Brahmajala Sutta. And the wrong view number 8 is the view that this thing, which is called vijnana, which is called mano, which is called chitta, this thing is the real self. The 5 senses are not self, but these things are the real self. And that is one of the wrong views. Chitta, vijnana, mano. And other suttas which talk about the chitta disappearing and coming to an end. Obviously, the chitta is not to be regarded as a permanent entity according to the EBTs, the early Buddhist texts, and yet this is so common. And I think one of the reasons is that we forget this idea of the asmimana anusaya. It is not about the I am being there. It is about the I am having a possibility of re-rising with that thing as its object. That is the problem. So, and that is, I think, where it comes from. So I think that is a very important part and a very important thing about the anusayas that need to be has to be, when you read the suttas, you will see the asmimana anusaya is quite commonly referred to. So saṃyojana, well, these are just, again, these are ties, and these are kind of handy, I suppose, because they are structured according to the degree of awakening that you have. Yeah, so you can talk about saṃyojanas that tie you in various degrees depending on where you are on that path. So they're kind of a handy way of thinking about whether you are fettered as a putujana, whether you are fettered as a streamment, or whether you are fettered as a non-returner, and this kind of things. So that's kind of where they are useful, and you can then of course focus on those fetters that are the main problem for you, depending on where you are on that path. So in the saṃyojanas for the three things that you give up when you become a stream mentor, of course, they are the silabbata paramasa, the holding on to virtue and observances. Sila is virtue, so literally holding on to virtue, and vata is like practices or observances. And it's a very interesting saṃyojana, because what does that actually mean? And I noticed that Ajahn Bhante Sujato, I should say, otherwise he might tell me off for calling him Ajahn Sujato, but Bhante Sujato, he translates paramasa there as misapprehension. And I think, with due respect to Bhante Sujato, that actually is a mistake, because paramasa does not mean misapprehension, it just means apprehension. So it just means that you are grasping onto these things. And that leaves, the interesting question, well, if it means that you give up the saṃyojana of grasping virtue and observances when you become a stream mentor, what does that mean if you're not stream mentor? And what it means is that we will grasp these things. It is not about misapprehension, it is actually about apprehension of these things. So if you are a putujana, if you are an ordinary person, you will grasp sila and vata to some extent. And it's okay. That's kind of what it's saying. It is fine. It's only when you become a stream mentor that you don't grasp these things anymore. Why not? Because when you become a stream mentor, this becomes part of who you are. This becomes part of your psychology. You cannot, this is why the stream mentor is said to be perfect in virtue, for precisely this reason. So we should grasp our virtue a little bit. If you don't grasp your virtue a little bit, you're not going to be virtuous. That's kind of just the nature of how we are. We tend in the wrong direction. And that is, I think, an important point, because sometimes I hear Buddhists that tell me, well, the three saṃyojanas that you have to overcome to be a stream mentor include silabbata paramasa. And so they say, well, that means we should stop clinging to these things or grasping these things. And no, that is not right. That is actually the wrong way of understanding the saṃyojanas. The saṃyojanas are not a way of thinking about how we should practice. The saṃyojanas are a way of thinking about what happens when we get certain results. It doesn't explain what we have to do, but it explains what happens when you become a stream mentor, for example. It is not a recipe for practice, it's a description of a particular process or the result of that process. And that is that is an important point, because if we don't stop holding on to these precepts or whatever it is, or sila or kindness, whatever it might be, we're going to fail, and we're going to fail on the path. So it's actually very important to understand these ideas correctly in that particular realm. So silabbata paramasa and sakkaya ditthi and the vicikicca, the three saṃyojanas for the stream entry. So having a good grasp of that actually does matter. But these are descriptions of what happens as you gradually, shed these bindings that binds us to samsaric existence, and they are useful as descriptions, but not as prescriptions as to how we should practice and what we should do.